I was remembering as I was preparing for the sermon when I was in high school, I was a basketball player. I fancied myself somewhat of a basketball star. One thing about it is I hated to lose. I still hate to lose. And so we were in practice one day, we were scrimmaging. I was on the junior varsity team recovering from a leg injury. We were playing the varsity team, and the varsity team had this guy, this stud of a center who thought he was all of that, and I thought he was about that much of that. And so we would go back and forth at each other during practice. Me trying to prove to myself and everybody who was watching that I was better than him trying to prove that he was the star that everybody thought he was. And so, so we were playing in scrimmage, and I was hitting shot after shot, just having an outstanding, a stellar performance. We were inbounding the ball, and they gave it to me on the inbound, and it fell off of my hands, and it fell on the line, and it bounced right up. But nobody saw that it fell on the line but me. And so the other team said, that ball fell on the line. I said, no, it didn't. You couldn't see it. You were behind me. The ball was in front of me. I know it didn't fall on the line. So we had this argument, and coach finally blew the whistle, and we went on with practice. And after practice was over, coach called me into his office, and he said, Nelson, did the ball bounce on the line? And I looked at him, wanting to tell the same lie I had told in practice, but it was harder sitting this close in front of him. And yeah, I said, I just want to know, did the ball bounce on the line? And I said, yes, coach, it bounced on the line. He said, well, why did you say it didn't bounce on the line? I said, because I wanted possession of the ball, and I wanted to win, and I wasn't going to give them anything that they couldn't prove. And coach said, Nelson, I understand the instinct. I understand the win at all cost instinct. What you have to understand is that it's dangerous. That more important than winning is winning the right way.
Right, amen.
And if it takes you lying and cheating in order to win, then the victory is not worth it.
That's right.
And I said, Coach, talking about a ball on a line in practice, like, it isn't that serious. And coach says, but Nelson, it is that serious.
Yes.
Because this is a microcosm of how you behave in the rest of your athletic career, which is really a microcosm of how you will behave in life.
Amen.
And if you will lie about a ball on a line in practice, and you will lie about something in a game, and you will lie about something in your life. And so I want you to master this one small thing so you can learn how to master the rest of your life.
Come on, sir.
We were talking about the ball that bounced on a line in practice, but we weren't at all talking about a ball that bounced on the line in practice. From the surface, the conversation that Jesus has with the Pharisees can look kind of trivial. An argument about healing a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day. It looks like it's such a trivial conversation. Jesus doesn't do anything major. He just tells the man to extend his hand, and the man extends his hand. It seems foolish that there should be an argument about the Sabbath day, but the argument really was not at all just about the Sabbath day. There's a bigger argument that was taking place, and this was just one microcosm, a small picture of what God was trying to do. You may remember from last week, if you were here. If you weren't, I'll fill you in quickly, that the Sabbath day was not created to be a high, holy day. It was not the purpose of it. The purpose of the Sabbath was not a day around which to frame worship. It was not a day in which people would come and bring their best to God. Those things came to be a part of it, but that was not the original intent of the Sabbath day. The original intent of the Sabbath day was to be a day of rest. When the people of Israel had been enslaved and in bondage in Egypt for so many years and forced to work over and over and over again without giving any rest, so much so that they cried out to God about their working conditions. They cried out to God in complaint about the way they were being treated in Egypt. God sent Moses to come into the land to let the people know that God heard their cries, and God was setting in motion a plan to let the people go. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh, and Moses and Pharaoh have one of the best negotiation sessions between a king and a non-king ever in history over whether or not the people could be let go on this 3-day vacation that Moses was trying to argue for. And Moses and Pharaoh get into this argument, and Pharaoh says, there's no way I'm going to do it. And Moses reveals over and over again that Moses is in connection with a power that is greater than Pharaoh's power.
That's right.
Moses has a rod that he gives to Aaron. Aaron lays down the rod becomes a snake. Pharaoh says, I'm not impressed. I have people who can do that too. And Pharaoh's prophets lay down their rods, and their rods become snakes as well. And then Moses' snake eats the other snakes, and Pharaoh says, well, maybe you can do a little something. Moses commits an act of eco-terrorism. He turns the water supply of the people of Egypt into blood. And Pharaoh sends his prophets to clean the water, but they cannot clean the water. They cannot undo what Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the slaves, has done. And so Pharaoh says, okay, I'll let the people have their vacation, except for as soon as the water is cleaned, Pharaoh does not let the people have their vacation. And over again, there is a battle between Moses and Pharaoh. Moses committing these acts of what we would call terrorism, sending flies and locusts on the people, frogs, boils, all of these things that disrupt the people's lives. Because if you are the leader of a group of slaves with a king that refuses to acknowledge your humanity, what object, what other method do you have of getting the king's attention other than doing something to disrupt the people's lives so that the people realize that the king really isn't as powerful as the king thinks he is? So that the people begin to realize that maybe there's something wrong with what the king is doing. It's why, my brothers and sisters, we ought to be cautious. And I'm not saying we ought not condemn acts of terrorism, especially when people take other people's lives, but we ought to be cautious about how we think about the terrorists, because terrorism doesn't just erupt out of nowhere. It does not erupt out of an evil impulse, but it is a people's response to a power that they perceive to be illegitimate, that when people are dictating the way people live without any thought for the people who are there, and they have no way of being able to negotiate the terms of their own living conditions, they turn to acts of terrorism. If you would actually read the accounts of our foremothers and forefathers when they were slaves here in America, you will find that many of them committed acts of terrorism there in their own plantations, destroying crops and property, killing horses. In fact, the reason that mules were used so often was because it was harder to kill a mule than it was to kill a horse, and less expensive to replace a mule than it was a horse, and that slaves would often poison and kill horses as a way of revolting against the conditions imposed upon them by those who claimed to be their masters. It is when you have no way of negotiating your own rights and freedom and space, you often resort to acts of what other people classify as terrorism. So Moses commits these acts of terrorism. And finally, in the last act, when Pharaoh will not budge and continues to backtrack on his word, God says, I am going to commit the last act that will force Pharaoh to let you go, I'm going to take the firstborn of every person in the land of Egypt. So the people will know that Pharaoh cannot even protect their children.
Wow. Yeah.
Not even Pharaoh's house will be exempt. And God does it, my brothers and sisters. God commits this painful, costly act. And Pharaoh is forced to let people go. And then you know the story as it goes from there. The people go to the Red Sea. They get to the Red Sea. They have not come back from their vacation as they claimed. And Pharaoh goes and leads the army to go and recapture the slaves or kill them in the desert one way or another. But slaves don't outsmart Pharaoh. That's not how it happens, except for Pharaoh has forgotten to account for the fact that the God of the slaves is powerful than any God that Pharaoh knows. And so God opens the Red Sea and the people cross on the other side. And Pharaoh, so determined that he would bring the people back, leads his army into the water that God opened for the slaves, only to have the water closed on his army. And Miriam sings a song, I will give praise to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, for horse and rider has thrown into the sea. My grandmother used to sing a song, Mary, don't you weep. Martha, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea. Mary, don't you weep. After they have gone to the other side, they have gotten out of Egypt, but the Egypt has not gotten out of them. My dad, who grew up in the projects in New Orleans, would often say, you can take a boy out of the projects, but it's harder to take the projects out of a boy. We can get delivered from our physical oppressive situations, but that does not change the impact that it has on us mentally. The harder thing, my brothers and sisters, is once we are out of oppression, to be able to live a life that appreciates and uses the freedom that God has given us. It's easy to recreate oppressive situations in our lives. That's what the people were doing. They were recreating their own oppression. And God says, I want to give you a set of laws that will provide some structure to help you live in a way that gets the oppression out of your society and out of your system, so you don't recreate Egypt in this new land that I'm giving you. And so he says, I want you to remember first that I am the Lord your God. I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So all of the other gods that are out there, you don't worship them, you worship me. Because every other god would have kept you a slave. But I'm the one that stepped in and delivered you. So don't give your allegiance to anything else other than me. You don't know what I look like. So don't make any images of me. Don't try to act like you know what I look like. Don't make images of a bull or a rabbit or anything else that are supposed to stand in the place of me, because you can't see me. Don't lie about what I've said to do. Don't take my name in vain. Don't say that I said things that I did not say. Don't treat my name as if it's frivolous. Create a Sabbath day, a day of rest. And on this day, everybody rests. You rest, your children rest, anybody who works for you rest. I'm so serious about this rest, I even want your cattle and your oxen and your animals to rest. Because when you were in Egypt, all Pharaoh did was work you. And he gave you no time to rest. And part of what it means to be human is to be able to take the time necessary to reflect. Not just to live life, but to actually think about what's happening in our lives. So there ought to be a day, a time, when you actually do some reflection, where you remember what it means to be human. When you reconnect with what it is that God is trying to do in the world. And so I want you to remember this day of rest. And I want it to be sacred for you. And that's where the Sabbath came from. It was the birth, the origin of the Sabbath. It was a day of rest to counter what Pharaoh did in Egypt, my brothers and sisters. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says, out of all the Old Testament, out of all the 10 commandments, that one is the most important, and it's the one that is most threatened by our present situation today. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Because we are living in a time increasingly where people try to squeeze the rest out of people. Anybody have a job where it seems like the number of hours you are working is constantly increasing? There's people who have to work 2 and 3 jobs in order to keep up with the economy. The cost of living has gone up, but the cost of our paychecks have not gone up to match it. You know, we can admit 2008 was a bad year. 2008 was a bad year for everybody. Everybody got hit. Even the wealthiest people got hit. Corporations got hit. Everybody lost money in 2008. The world was on the brink of economic collapse. But since 2008, corporations have made more money in the last 5 years than any time in the history of the world. Not just brought in more money, I'm talking about profits. The money they made on top of what it costs to manufacture goods and provide services. The profits are higher than in any other time, yet our paychecks aren't higher than in any other time in the history of the world. People aren't getting paid in accordance with what the corporations are making, not unless you're the CEO at the top. And so if you want to try not to keep up with the Joneses, but if you just want to keep up with the basic standard of living, you've got to make sacrifices. And the easiest and the first thing to sacrifice is rest. It's not by accident, my brothers and sisters. The truth is that people who are pushing our society in a direction, they remembered the last time that people pushed back. They remembered what happened when people got together. A lot of them got together in churches, actually, and decided that it was time for society to reflect more the image of the way God created people to live in existence. And this movement that was largely birthed out of the civil rights movement, but it actually spawned from there, that created so much social change, they did not like that. And so they decided what they would do was they would create a society where people had to work so much and have so little time for rest that they would actually not have the time to be able to think about changing or moving society, that they would just be trying to do their best to scrape and survive, keeping your head above water. making your way when you're down. It's a plan. It was an engineered plan by people who profit off of the misery of others. People who rejoice when the president's healthcare website crashes, rather than trying to help figure out a way to provide people more health care. They actually celebrate the fact that people aren't getting health care. It's a wicked system we're living in, my brothers and sisters. A system that looks at and rejoices and profits off of the misery of the people. A system that looks at a man with a withered hand and would rather use that man to try to trap Jesus than to actually think about how to help this man with this withered hand. We live in a broken system, but it's not a new system. It's the same system that they were dealing with in Egypt. It's the same system that they were dealing with under Rome. It's broken, but it's not new. They look at this man with the withered hand. What is Jesus going to do? Is he going to break the tradition that we have established around the Sabbath to heal this man? And Jesus gets up in front of them and he says, what is more appropriate to do on the Sabbath day? To help this man who is broken find a path to wholeness, or to sit back and let him stay broken in a false sense of religiosity and worship? What's more appropriate for this day? Meeting somebody's actual real need, or remaining still in an atmosphere, a posture of piousness?
Come on, sir.
Trying to pretend that we are something that we are not. What's more appropriate on this day? And the people would not say a word. And Jesus, those of you who were in our leadership class on yesterday, we talked about having this sense of inner authority. Jesus had this sense of inner authority. He knew what God was calling him to do. He did not need the approval of the crowd to do it. Jesus, being angry at their religiosity, says to the man, stretch forth your hand. And the man's hand is healed. And the Pharisees are angry, so angry that they went and cut a deal with Herod's people. To understand the richness of what's happening, my brothers and sisters, you got to know a little bit about Herod. Herod wasn't just your average governor. Herod was the governor of the region. He had a little power under Pilate because he cut a deal with the Romans to help actually get the temple rebuilt. And that temple that they were worshiping was known as Herod's temple. He had that temple rebuilt. So he had cut a deal with the Romans and was able to rule over the area. But Herod was a brutal and cruel dictator. This Herod was the son of Herod the Great, and you might remember Herod the Great if you remember the Christmas story in which after Jesus is born, Herod hears that there is a Messiah, a king of the Jews that is born in the land, and Herod, wanting to be the only person known as the king of the Jews, inquires about his whereabouts that he might go and worship him. And by worship him, he actually means kill him. And so Herod asked the three wise men who come traveling from the east where this man is, and they go and find him. And the Spirit directs them not to go back and tell Herod, because Herod has evil intent. And so when Herod cannot find out the information, he is so enraged that he decides that he's going to go to the region where he knows this Jesus is supposed to be, and kill every toddler 2 years old and under. Trying to get one, he will commit mass genocide. This is the type of person that Herod was. Not only that, my brothers and sisters, but the historian Josephus said that Herod knew that the people did not like him because he went around killing people's kids. I wouldn't like him either. And he knew when he got sick that the people would rejoice rather than mourn that he was dead. So the historian says that he gathered the heads, the most important members of the most important families of all Jerusalem, and had them held hostage as he lay on his deathbed, and gave the order that when he breathed his last breath, that the heads of all the families should be killed, so that when he died, there would be mourning in the land, even if it was not for him. This was Herod. And the Pharisees were so afraid of what Jesus was doing, so afraid of this movement that Jesus was building, that they would rather cut a deal with the son of a brutal dictator that killed people at his whim than to deal with Jesus. God was trying and still is trying to birth not a church, not an institution, not even a building, but a type of movement that would recognize people's real and authentic needs and meet and minister to their needs. That would recognize that everybody deserves to be treated with worth and dignity and respect. That we are all created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, people ought to have access to the things that they need to live like somebody created in the image of God. In our day and time, it would be that nobody should have to go to a job that they work for 40 hours a week and not make enough money to live in the society in which they are working. That does not make sense. In the richest and most powerful nation in the world, nobody should not have access to health care, not be able to get treated for diseases that we have cures for, die from preventable illnesses because of lack of health care. In a world where HIV and AIDS is tearing up portions of the world, where there are countries in Africa where the rate of HIV and AIDS is just mind-blowingly astronomical, that pharmaceutical companies should not be able to charge so much for medicine that people can't have access to it. When they could make it for cheaper, or somebody else could make it for cheaper, except for there's a thing called a patent law that won't allow other people to make it for cheaper. So out of respect of a patent law, we will let millions of people die every year so that some corporations and some companies can make money. In the midst of this, there's a movement of the Spirit of God that saying people need to live free. People need access to the best that God has for them. And that's the movement, the work of God's Spirit. saying that these rules and restrictions that we've placed that stop people from being the best of who God calls them to be run up against what God is trying to do. God is calling for people to stand in Moses' shoes. People who will do more than just sing about Jesus, but will actually follow Jesus. Not just in name and not just call themselves a Christian and wear a cross, but actually do the work that Jesus did. This is what God is calling for in this day, my brothers and sisters. There's some bad news to it. I would not be a good pastor if I did not tell you the bad news. The bad news is that when you push against a system that is trying to keep people down, the system does not treat you kindly. It labels you a lunatic, a radical. It tries to ostracize you and alienate you. Tries to embarrass you. Ultimately, if none of those work, it will try to kill you. The Pharisees would rather cut a deal with Herod than to deal with Jesus, because the work that Jesus was trying to do was threatening to their existence. The system doesn't like people who try to push too hard. It's the bad news, my brothers and sisters. But there is good news. Now, I wouldn't be a good pastor if I didn't tell you the good news.
Amen. I like that.
And the good news is that the system doesn't have the last word. Evil never has the last word. Martin Luther King said it this way. He said, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." My grandmother would say it this way. She would say, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." No matter how you say it, my brothers and sisters, the same truth is there, is that evil can only exist for so long. But God's truth always outlives evil. Pharaoh's army had an end to their power. And when they ended, God's truth was still living on. Rome and all of its might and all of its glory burned to the ground. But the Church of Jesus Christ outlived the Roman Empire. And even this current system of evil, my brothers and sisters, has an expiration date. It can only last but so long. And when this current evil has been forgotten about, when it is just a footnote in the book of history, my brothers and sisters, the movement of God's kingdom will still be marching on. My brothers and sisters, I just want to tell you that we are on the winning side. And even if it does not look like we are winning today, that you ought to keep your head up, my brothers and sisters. Even if it looks like we are losing on every hand today, don't get discouraged, my brothers and sisters. Even if it looks like today that evil sits on the throne and goodness is hanging in the gallows, don't give up, my brothers and sisters. Don't give in. Don't be tempted to be quiet and let evil continue to reign, my brothers and sisters, but stand up and lift up your voice, knowing that the God that we serve, the God of justice, has the final word. my brothers and sisters, we know that God has the final word because the Pharisees and Herod's people did conspire against Jesus. They did plot and they did plan. They planned to have Jesus arrested and tried in court, my brothers and sisters. And when they could not find anybody who would speak against them, they planted people to tell lies against him. They had him beaten all night long. They could not have him crucified themselves, so they took him to Pilate to ask Pilate to crucify Jesus, to put him on public display so that anybody who followed Jesus would see what a horrible end Jesus and his movement would come to. And they did crucify him, my brothers and sisters. The Bible said he hung on the cross from the 6th to the 9th hour. They did crucify him, my brothers and sisters, and placed him in a borrowed tomb. But the pharaohs of the world, the Caesars of the world, the Pharisees and Herod's people, and even Pontius Pilate, they could not stop what God was doing, my brothers and sisters. Because the Bible tells me that early on Sunday morning, that God overwrote the death decree, my brothers and sisters. That the execution order went to God's desk, and God vetoed the execution order and sent it back through the angels, my brothers and sisters. And the angels came to the tomb to move the stone away. And when they moved the stone away, my brothers and sisters, they didn't have to get Jesus up because he had already gotten up with all power in his hands, my brothers and sisters. And the same Spirit of God